Somewhere beneath the dry earth of northern Iraq, buried under centuries of silence and sand, lie the remains of an empire so powerful that the ancient world trembled at its name. It built the first professional army history had ever seen, deported entire nations as casually as moving chess pieces across a board, and raised cities of such staggering beauty that even its enemies were left speechless. Its kings carved their conquests into stone with brutal precision, leaving records of campaigns, sieges, and subjugations that archaeologists are still deciphering today. One of its rulers marched his armies to the very gates of Jerusalem, and the confrontation that followed was deemed important enough to be recorded both in royal palace reliefs and in the pages of the Bible. At its height, this empire stretched from the banks of the Nile all the way to the shores of the Persian Gulf, ruling over more people and more land than any power that had come before it. And then, in a span of time so short it still astonishes historians, it vanished, its great cities burned, its kings forgotten, its very existence reduced to dust and legend. Welcome back, dear listener, and welcome to Whispered Empires, where history unfolds slowly, quietly, and at just the right pace for a peaceful night's rest. Tonight, we are traveling deep into the ancient world, to the banks of the Tigris River, where one of history's greatest and most fearsome civilizations once stood. Before we begin, if you enjoy these journeys through the past, please consider liking this video and subscribing to join our growing family of nighttime historians. We would also love to know, what time is it where you are right now, and which part of the world are you watching from? And as you settle in tonight, here is something to wonder about. If the most powerful empire of the ancient world could vanish so completely in just a few decades, what does that say about the nature of power itself? Now close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let history carry you gently into the night. Along the western bank of the Tigris River, where the current bends sharply around a limestone cliff rising some 25 meters above the valley floor, there is a place that carries within it the memory of an entire civilization. The city of Ashur, spelled sometimes Assur, sometimes Khalat-Sherkat, sits at the heart of what is now northern Iraq. From this elevated rocky plateau, the ancient world stretched outward in every direction. The river curved below. The valley opened wide. And whoever stood upon that promontory could see and be seen for a very great distance. The location was no accident. Ashur occupied what ancient geographers might have called a crossroads of the world. It sat at the ecological boundary between rain-fed farmland and irrigated agriculture, drawing resources from both. The Tigris River, bending around the city's rocky foundation, offered both protection and passage. Caravans moving between Anatolia, the Levant, and the heart of Mesopotamia passed through or near this place. Goods flowed, ideas traveled, wealth accumulated. Long before Ashur became the capital of an empire, it was already something remarkable. A thriving platform of commerce at the meeting point of ancient worlds. The god and the city shared a single name. Ashur, both the place and the divine being worshipped within it, were inseparable. The deity Ashur was the chief god of the Assyrian pantheon, the national protector. the one whose blessing meant prosperity and whose anger meant ruin. He was depicted as a winged sun disk, sometimes bearing a figure drawing a bow, a symbol uniting solar radiance with martial power. The king was considered his earthly representative, even his incarnation. When the king marched to war, Ashur marched beside him. When the king conquered, Ashur was understood to have willed it so. Around 2025 BC, the city of Ashur rose as an independent city-state under a ruler named Dur-Sharrukin III. This beginning marked what historians call the Old Assyrian period, a time stretching across several centuries of political development, cultural growth, and commercial expansion. The Assyrian people developed their own dialect of the Akkadian language during this era, and their own calendar. The city was turbulent, sometimes falling under the influence of outside powers, yet always reasserting its distinct identity. From these early centuries emerged a civilization conscious of its own character, shaped by trade, by religion, and by the river that flowed endlessly beneath its walls. Among the most remarkable achievements of this early period was the establishment of merchant colonies far beyond Mesopotamia's borders. Assyrian traders carried finely woven textiles and tin across more than 1,000 miles of difficult terrain into Anatolia, exchanging them for silver and gold. They settled in trading districts called Karum, adjacent to native Anatolian cities, operating under legal agreements with local rulers. The greatest of these colonies was Karum-Kanesh, located at modern Kultepe in present-day Turkey. For over 2 centuries it served as the administrative heart of the entire trading network. Home to several hundred Assyrian merchants living permanently abroad, their lives recorded on more than 22,000 clay tablets. The wealth flowing through these merchant networks was not merely silver and tin. It was the foundation of a society. Successful trading families rose into an emerging elite, building impressive homes that served as monuments to their prosperity. Merchants purchased fine luxury goods for their households. The silver accumulated through Anatolian trade fed back into the city of Ashur, funding temples, walls, and administrative institutions. This early commercial infrastructure, documented in extraordinary detail across thousands of clay tablets, created the economic backbone upon which later Assyrian kings would build their military power. Commerce came first. Conquest followed, but without the former, the latter would have been impossible. The Middle Assyrian period, beginning around 1365 BC, brought transformation of a deeper kind. Under rulers such as Ashur-uballit I, Adad-nirari I, and Tukulti-Ninurta I, Assyria shed the character of a city-state and assumed the proportions of an empire. Territories expanded toward the Euphrates in the west, into Babylonia in the south, and toward the Zagros foothills in the east. The god Ashur was reinterpreted, no longer only a civic deity, but now explicitly a god of war and imperial expansion identified with the great Sumerian god Enlil. Power and religion fused more tightly than ever. Military conquest became not merely ambition, but sacred obligation. But empires, even strong ones, are not immune to the pressures of history. Between roughly 1250 and 1150 BC, a catastrophic wave of disruption swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Civilizations collapsed. Great cities were abandoned. The Hittites vanished as a major power. Egypt retreated. The Mycenaean world fell silent. Assyria survived this Bronze Age collapse more intact than most, yet it was not untouched. Internal strife fractured the royal line. Aramaean migrations pressed against Assyrian borders. By the century following 1056 BC, the empire had contracted dramatically, holding only its immediate heartland. The great territorial reach of the Middle Assyrian period had, for a time, slipped away. Then, slowly, a recovery began. The Neo-Assyrian Empire emerged in the early Iron Age as Assyrian kings reasserted control, rebuilt administrative systems, and reorganized their armies. Ashurnasirpal II, who came to power in 883 BC, inherited a state already revitalized by his grandfather Adad-nirari II and his father Tukulti-Ninurta II. What he inherited was formidable. A hardened military, accumulated resources, and a tradition of royal authority rooted in centuries of practice. Over the following 25 years, he would transform this inheritance into something the ancient world had not yet witnessed. A state governed by calculated force, meticulous administration, and an architecture of power designed to be seen and remembered. Ashurnasirpal II reorganized the Assyrian military with a thoroughness that set new standards for ancient warfare. Cavalry units were introduced alongside traditional infantry and chariot forces, giving the army flexibility across varied terrain. Chariot designs were improved. 6-spoked wheels, 4 horses, armored platforms carrying 3 men, creating mobile firing platforms of considerable power. Siege technology was expanded through battering rams mounted on wheeled vehicles. The king conducted 14 major military campaigns, pushing Assyrian authority toward the Mediterranean, the Taurus Mountains, and the Armenian highlands. And wherever resistance appeared, it was met not only with force, but with a deliberate spectacle of terror. Inscribed in stone, displayed on walls, and carried home in the memory of every witness. The new capital at Kalhu, the city we know as Nimrud, stood as the crowning statement of everything Ashurnasirpal II had built. Constructed on a bend above the Tigris, its northwest palace measured over 600 feet in length. Its walls were lined with carved alabaster panels, winged protective spirits, royal hunts, divine ceremonies, and the standard inscription listing the king's titles across every surface. An inauguration banquet drew nearly 70,000 guests over 10 days. The city itself was a message, written in stone, carved in relief, and fed with the silver and grain of conquered lands. Ashurnasirpal II had built the foundation, a state defined by iron will and calculated power. But it would take a different kind of genius, a century later, to turn that foundation into the machinery of a true empire. Before the empire could be remade, it first had to survive. In the decades before 745 BCE, Assyria had grown hollow at its center. 3 kings in succession had allowed power to drift away from the throne. Military commanders claimed victories for themselves. Plague moved through the cities. Provinces erupted in rebellion. The last of these weak rulers, Ashur-nirari IV, conducted barely 3 campaigns in nearly a decade of reign, seldom leaving the capital, raising no monuments, leaving almost no trace. Into that silence, a governor from the city of Kalhu gathered his strength, and the old world quietly ended. His name at birth was Pulu. The biblical texts would remember him by that name, Pul, a man who rose not through clean inheritance, but through the fire of civil war. In 745 BCE, revolt broke out at the royal palace in Kalhu. The forces of Pulu's faction overwhelmed the guard, seized the palace, and destroyed the royal family. Whether Pulu ignited the uprising or simply rode its momentum to the throne remains uncertain. But upon taking power, he set aside his birth name entirely, adopting instead a title carved from history: Tiglath-Pileser, the name of great kings long before him. The message was deliberate. The new ruler intended to be remembered. Whether Tiglath-Pileser III was truly a usurper remains a question historians have not fully resolved. A mutilated brick inscription names him the son of Adad-Nirari III. The Assyrian king list places him as a son of Ashurnasirpal II. His own inscriptions speak only of divine selection, never of royal bloodline. An unusual omission that suggests something to conceal. The Babylonian king list treats him and his successor as a separate dynasty altogether. Scholars such as Karen Radner have argued that he was a legitimate contender, victorious in an intra-dynastic struggle. What is clear is that no rebellion followed his ascension. The empire accepted him, and he gave it no reason to reconsider. His first great transformation was not on the battlefield. It was inside the empire itself. Before Tiglath-Pileser, Assyria had governed through a loose network of powerful provincial magnates, local rulers who could accumulate wealth, command armies, and challenge the throne. He dismantled this system methodically. Where there had been roughly 12 large provinces, he created as many as 80 smaller ones by the end of his reign. He appointed governors directly, often choosing eunuchs to ensure that no provincial dynasty could take root. In each district, 2 officials were required to agree before presenting policy to the king. No single voice could grow too loud. Power flowed inward, towards the throne, and nowhere else. Alongside the administrative reforms, Tiglath-Pileser rebuilt the army itself. What had existed before was a seasonal force. Farmers conscripted at harvest's end, poorly equipped, fighting for a fixed period and then returning home. He replaced this with something the ancient world had rarely seen: a standing professional military, maintained year-round, paid and equipped by the state. The royal corps, known as the Kisir Shari, formed the permanent heart of the force. Provincial levies supplemented it, but foreign troops recruited from defeated peoples were clothed in Assyrian equipment and integrated as equals, indistinguishable from native soldiers. The army became not just a weapon of conquest, but a permanent institution of empire. The Assyrian army was a machine of many parts. Infantry formed its foundation. Spearmen, archers, and shield-bearers moving in disciplined formations. Cavalry provided speed and shock, the first large-scale mounted force in history, armed with lances and later bows, capable of flanking and pursuit. Chariots still rolled across battlefields carrying archers and drivers for mobile ranged strikes. But perhaps most feared was the engineering corps. Specialists who built siege ramps of packed earth reinforced with flat stone, wheeled towers combining elevated archer platforms with battering rams, and tunnels dug beneath enemy walls. At Lachish, this full system was deployed with devastating precision. Archaeologists would later uncover over 1,500 skulls left behind in the rubble. Control over such a vast and restless empire required more than soldiers. It required the movement of populations themselves. Tiglath-Pileser III was the first Assyrian king to make mass deportation a formal policy of state. Entire peoples were uprooted from their homelands and resettled in distant provinces. The goals were clear: scatter the communities most likely to rebel, dismantle local power structures, repopulate the Assyrian heartland with labor, and blur the ethnic lines that might otherwise harden into resistance. Deportees were not enslaved in the traditional sense. They were integrated as subjects, assigned to agricultural lands, construction projects, and craft roles. The empire absorbed them. In doing so, it grew stronger with every displacement. Among the populations most deeply affected were those of the Levant. The northern kingdom of Israel lost great portions of its territory between 734 and 732 BCE. Tiglath-Pileser annexed the lands north of the Jezreel Valley and the Transjordanian Plateau. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, Dan, and Naphtali were deported and vanished from historical record. From Galilee alone, approximately 13,500 people were removed, from a population estimated at only 18,000. Across the wider region, cities like Gaza and Ashkelon paid tribute. Tyre and Byblos submitted. The kingdoms of Edom, Moab, and Ammon acknowledged Assyrian overlordship. One by one, the old sovereignties of the Levant became echoes of themselves. To the south, Tiglath-Pileser turned his attention toward Babylon, not to destroy it, but to possess it. A Chaldean tribal leader named Ukin-Zer had seized the Babylonian throne around 734 BCE. Over 3 years, Tiglath-Pileser employed both armies and diplomacy, winning rival Chaldean and Aramean chiefs to his cause, isolating the usurper until he fled. In 729 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser personally assumed the Babylonian throne, taking the ancient title of King of Sumer and Akkad. He participated in the sacred Akitu festival, performing the ritual of taking the hand of the god Marduk. Unlike predecessors who had claimed the title without recognition, he became the first Assyrian king, accepted as the legitimate ruler of Babylonia in Babylonian records. By the end of his reign in 727 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser III had more than doubled the extent of Assyrian territory. The empire stretched from the Persian Gulf in the east to the shores of the Mediterranean in the west, encompassing all of Mesopotamia, Babylonia, and the Levant, reaching into the Iranian plateau and pressing against the northern borders of Egypt. Scholars have called it the first true empire in history, a multi-ethnic, multilingual state without regional rivals. Holding it together required not only armies and deportations, but governors, quotas, annual audits, standardized taxation, and roads that carried messages and soldiers alike across enormous distances. It was a machine, vast and intricate, and it was still running when Tiglath-Pileser closed his eyes for the last time. Tiglath-Pileser III was succeeded in 727 BCE by his son Shalmaneser V, who kept the machinery of empire turning, maintaining the provinces, continuing campaigns against Israel, besieging Samaria, and holding Babylon. But Shalmaneser was not his father. He lacked the exceptional discipline and political genius that had made the empire possible. 5 years into his reign, his own brother removed him from the throne. That brother was Sargon II, who would prove himself, in time, the true inheritor of Tiglath-Pileser's legacy. With the machinery of empire now firmly in place, the throne passed to a man who would gamble everything on his own immortality. Building a city to house his glory, only to leave it forever haunted. In the ancient world, names carried weight. They were declarations, promises made to gods and people alike. When a new king rose to the Assyrian throne in 722 BCE, he did not present himself by his birth name, which history has never recovered. Instead, he chose the name Sargon. In Akkadian, the word reached back through centuries, Sharrukin, meaning the legitimate king, the true king. It was a name borrowed from legend itself, invoking Sargon of Akkad, the great founder king who had built the world's first empire nearly 16 centuries before. Whether Sargon II was a legitimate heir or a usurper has long been a question scholars have turned over carefully. He was most likely the son of Tiglath-Pileser III and the brother of his predecessor Shalmaneser V. His own inscriptions reference his royal fathers and situate him within the existing dynasty. Yet the name he chose, the opposition he faced during his first years, and the age at which he came to power, somewhere between 40 and 50, have kept the debate alive. Modern historians increasingly lean toward legitimacy, though the silence of earlier records leaves room for quiet uncertainty. When Sargon inherited the throne, he also inherited a siege. His predecessor Shalmaneser V had already spent years pressing against the walls of Samaria, capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. The city had been weakened for decades. Tiglath-Pileser III had taken the Galilee region in 732 BCE and carried populations eastward. Samaria itself had been blockaded for 3 years. Now, with Shalmaneser gone and Sargon newly crowned, the siege continued. In his own inscriptions, Sargon recorded the eventual capture plainly. 27,280 people taken from the city, carried away into the Assyrian Empire. The fall of Samaria marked the end of the northern kingdom of Israel, a state that had existed as an independent entity for roughly 2 centuries since Solomon's death in 930 BCE. The deportation that followed was systematic. 27,000 people were resettled, primarily in Guzana in the Assyrian heartland, and in the cities of the Medes in what is now northwestern Iran. Scholars estimate this represented perhaps 10 to 20% of the total population. Many others fled southward to Judah. Those who remained in Samaria gradually intermarried with newly settled peoples from Babylonia, Elam, and Syria, eventually becoming the people known as the Samaritans. From the dispersal of these northern tribes grew one of antiquity's most enduring mysteries. The 10 tribes that had comprised the northern kingdom, Reuben, Simeon, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Manasseh, and Ephraim, vanished from the historical record. The Hebrew Bible recorded their exile as divine punishment for religious transgression. The surviving southern kingdom of Judah, comprising the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, became in this telling the true continuation of Israel. The northern 10 carried into the lands of Assyria faded from written memory. They became, across the centuries, the 10 lost tribes, a mystery that would generate legends, claims, and searches stretching far into the modern world. With Israel subdued and incorporated as the Assyrian province of Samarina, Sargon turned his attention across the wider empire. In 720 BCE, he crushed a Syrian rebellion. Between 717 and 716 BCE, his armies absorbed the wealthy city-state of Carchemish, whose plundered silver was so vast it reportedly replaced copper as the empire's primary currency. In 714 BCE, he marched through mountainous terrain to strike the sacred city of Musasia, heart of the rival Urartian kingdom, sacking it thoroughly. Around 710 BCE, he turned south to Babylonia, defeating the rebel king Marduk-apal-iddina and reclaiming control of that ancient land. Campaign after campaign, Sargon's empire grew. The wealth of these campaigns, particularly the silver flowing from Carchemish, gave Sargon a vision. Rather than rule from Assur or Nineveh or Arbela, cities that carried the legacies of other kings before him, he would build an entirely new capital, a city that would belong to him alone. He chose a site at the foot of Mount Musri near Nineveh, a place with no prior construction, no inherited architecture. He called it Dur-Sharrukin, the fortress of Sargon. Foundations were laid around 717 BCE. The name itself echoed his chosen identity, evoking Sargon of Akkad, the ancient founder, the builder of the first great empire. Dur-Sharrukin rose over 6 to 7 years, assembled by an empire-wide workforce. Conscripted peasants, seasonal labourers, skilled stonecutters, masons, carpenters, sculptors and metalworkers were drawn from provinces across the Assyrian world. Cedar timber arrived from Lebanon. Alabaster, copper, bronze, gold, and lapis lazuli were gathered from across conquered territories. The finished city covered just over 1 square mile, its walls reaching 24 meters in thickness, punctuated by 7 monumental gates. Magnetic surveys conducted as recently as 2022 revealed at least 5 enormous buildings within the walls beyond the palace itself, evidence of a far more complete urban environment than archaeologists had previously imagined. Within the palace of Dur-Sharrukin, carved alabaster panels covered the walls, painted in vivid blues and reds. They depicted hunting scenes, court ceremonies, tribute-bearing delegations, and the great transport of cedar timber from Lebanon. One monumental figure stood nearly 5 meters tall, a heroic form effortlessly strangling a lion, often identified with the legendary Gilgamesh, symbolizing the king's omnipotence over the forces of chaos. At every entrance stood the lamassu, immense winged bulls carved from single alabaster blocks weighing around 28 tons, their bodies those of bulls, their wings those of eagles, their crowned human faces thought to resemble Sargon himself. They were guardians, and they were statements. Dur-Sharrukin was more than a city. It was an argument in stone. Its dedicatory inscriptions proclaimed Sargon's victories and warned against the defacement of his works. Its architecture deliberately recalled and surpassed earlier Assyrian imperial capitals. By settling conquered peoples within its walls on equal footing with native Assyrians and imposing uniform taxation, Sargon presented his city as the physical expression of a unified empire, diverse, ordered, and loyal to one king. His brother Sin-Ahu-Usur, holding the powerful position of Grand Vizier, received his own royal residence within the city walls, binding dynastic authority to the very bricks of Dur-Sharrukin. The city was inaugurated formally in 706 BCE. Dur-Sharrukin endured for scarcely a year. In the early summer of 705 BCE, Sargon led his army into Tabal in central Anatolia to suppress a rebellion. It was one of the few times in his later reign that he personally took the field. The forces of Gurdi of Kuluma launched a sudden attack on the Assyrian camp. Sargon was killed in the fighting, and his body could not be recovered. In Assyrian belief, a king without proper burial was condemned to wander as a restless spirit for eternity, cursed, abandoned by the gods. His son Sennacherib, deeply shaken, abandoned Dur-Sharrukin entirely, and the great city Sargon had built was swiftly swallowed by silence. The cursed city of Dur-Sharrukin faded into silence. But Sargon's son was already building something far more magnificent in its place. A capital that would become the largest city in the ancient world, and the stage for one of history's most debated confrontations. When Sargon II fell in battle against the Cimmerians in 705 BC, his body was never recovered. For the ancient world, this was deeply unsettling. A king left unburied, his fate unresolved. His son Sennacherib, then roughly 35 years old, inherited the throne that August. He had spent years as crown prince, governing from Nineveh, leading campaigns in the northern borderlands. He was prepared. Yet the shadow of his father's inauspicious end would quietly shape every decision that followed, beginning with where Sennacherib chose to build his world. Sennacherib made a deliberate and striking choice. He would not rebuild his father's capital at Dur-Sharrukin. He would not mention Sargon II in any inscription, erect no monument linking his reign to his father's. Scholars describe this as an almost complete denial. Instead, Sennacherib turned to Nineveh, an ancient city settled since at least 3000 BC, a place that had served as capital under the Middle Assyrian Kingdom for centuries. It was familiar ground, it carried deep roots, and it offered Sennacherib exactly what he needed: the freedom to build something entirely his own. What Sennacherib built at Nineveh was staggering in scale. The city grew to roughly 7 square kilometers, home to perhaps 120,000 souls, one of the largest urban centers on Earth. New fortification walls stretched 12 kilometers around the city, 25 meters thick and possibly 30 meters tall, pierced by 15 great gates adorned with stone colossi of lamassu and winged bulls. Streets were laid in orderly patterns. Temples rose alongside administrative buildings. Nineveh became more than twice the size of its predecessor capitals at Nimrud and Khorsabad, a monument to a king rewriting his own legacy in stone. At the heart of Nineveh rose the Southwest Palace, which Sennacherib himself named the Palace Without Rival. Measuring roughly 500 by 240 meters, with at least 80 rooms, it was the largest palace the Assyrian Empire had ever constructed. Its walls were panelled in cedar, cypress, ivory, and ebony. Nearly 3 kilometers of carved stone reliefs wound through its corridors, depicting battles, hunts, and mythological scenes. A grand throne room served as the focal point of royal ceremony. Sennacherib declared in his royal inscriptions that this palace was his abode, and no inscription was modest about what he had achieved. Beyond the palace walls, Sennacherib built something extraordinary. Terraced gardens of extraordinary beauty, with trees planted on stone arches and vines trailing down hanging terraces. An elaborate network of 18 canals fed the gardens, drawing water from surrounding hills. The centerpiece was the Jerwan Aqueduct, constructed from more than 2 million dressed limestone blocks and capable of carrying water 65 kilometers to the city. Some scholars, notably Oxford Assyriologist Stephanie Daly, have proposed that these gardens at Nineveh, not Babylon, may have been the original Hanging Gardens, the lost wonder of the ancient world. The debate remains gently, beautifully unresolved. Far from Nineveh, in the small highland kingdom of Judah, a king named Hezekiah watched Assyrian power with careful eyes. He had spent years dismantling foreign shrines, purging idols, and centralizing worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem. He fortified his capital, most significantly, by commissioning the Siloam Tunnel. 533 meters of hand-hewn stone channeling water from the Gihon Spring, deep inside the city walls. When Sargon II died in 705 BC and Sennacherib was occupied suppressing rebellion in Babylon, Hezekiah recognized a window. He formed a coalition with Philistine cities, Phoenician Sidon and Egypt, and he rebelled. Sennacherib's response came in 701 BC. His third campaign swept through the Levant like a slow, inevitable tide. Phoenician cities submitted or fell. Philistine Ashkelon was taken by force. An Egyptian army that marched to El Teke to aid the rebels was defeated. Across Judah, the Assyrians systematically reduced 46 fortified cities and countless smaller towns, capturing vast numbers of people and livestock, according to the royal annals. The campaign moved steadily toward Jerusalem, but first it stopped at Lachish, the great walled city perched on a steep hill in the Judean lowlands, Judah's most formidable fortress outside the capital itself. The siege of Lachish was methodical and total. Assyrian engineers constructed massive earthen ramps against the southern slope of the hill to move battering rams and siege towers into position against the walls. Defenders hurled stones, arrows, and fire torches from the towers above. After weeks of sustained assault, the walls were breached. The city fell. Captured defenders were executed. Many were impaled before the eyes of survivors. The remaining population was deported. Sennacherib considered Lachish significant enough to commission a monumental room of stone reliefs in his palace at Nineveh, commemorating the victory. Reliefs now preserved in the British Museum in London. With Lachish fallen, Sennacherib's forces turned toward Jerusalem. The city was surrounded. Sennacherib's own annals record that he shut Hezekiah inside his royal city like a caged bird, building a ring of fortresses around its walls. The Taylor Prism, a baked clay hexagonal cylinder discovered at Nineveh in 1830 and now housed in the British Museum, preserves this account in Akkadian cuneiform, one of 3 nearly identical prisms recording Sennacherib's campaigns. The prism states that the awful splendor of Sennacherib's lordship overwhelmed Hezekiah, who ultimately sent substantial tribute to Nineveh, including gold, silver, ivory-inlaid furniture, his own daughters, and musicians. Why did Sennacherib's army ultimately withdraw without taking Jerusalem? The question has occupied scholars across centuries. The biblical accounts in 2 Kings and Isaiah describe an angel of the Lord striking down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in a single night. The ancient historian Herodotus recorded a different story. Field mice swarming through the Assyrian camp, gnawing bowstrings and shield straps, leaving the army defenseless. Some scholars interpret the mice as a symbolic memory of plague. Others point to military pragmatism. Jerusalem was formidable, Hezekiah had paid tribute, and Assyria had already achieved its strategic goals. No single answer has fully settled the silence. Sennacherib returned to Nineveh, his palace without rival, his great walled city. His hanging gardens fed by water carried across 65 kilometers of carved stone. He ruled for 2 more decades before his own sons. Angered by his decision to disinherit the eldest in favor of Esarhaddon, conspired against him. On the 20th of October, 681 BC, Sennacherib was assassinated in a temple at Nineveh, possibly crushed by a fallen statue. Esarhaddon seized the throne, defeated his brothers, and reversed one of his father's most controversial acts by ordering the restoration of Babylon. Sennacherib's death left the throne to a son who would push the empire to its absolute limits, conquering even Egypt, while his own son would preside over its greatest cultural flowering and its most devastating internal wound. When Sennacherib fell to its own sons in the autumn of 681 BC, the great Assyrian throne was left without a certain heir. The youngest son, Esarhaddon, had already been named crown prince some years before, and the whole empire had sworn oaths to support him. Yet two older brothers, Adamulisu and Nabu-Saru-Usur, had taken their father's life inside a temple at Nineveh, believing the throne was theirs to claim. What followed was a brief and quiet civil war, lasting only 6 weeks before Esarhaddon's forces met his brothers at a place called Hanigalbat, and most of the opposing soldiers simply walked away to join him instead. Esarhaddon entered Nineveh on the 10th of March in 680 BC and took the Assyrian throne as the sole and uncontested king. He moved swiftly and methodically in the days that followed, purging those who had conspired with his brothers, executing enemies within the royal court, and eliminating those whose loyalty had faltered. Even the servants responsible for the security of the palace did not escape his reach. Some supporters of his brothers managed to flee abroad, disappearing into distant lands. Esarhaddon had endured a long road to power, but the empire now rested entirely in his hands, and he would prove to be one of the most consequential rulers Assyria had ever known. Across the desert and along the ancient Nile, another powerful ruler held his throne with equal determination. Taharqa was a pharaoh of the 25th dynasty, a Kushite king who had risen from the lands of Napata in what is now Sudan, to rule over both Upper and Lower Egypt. He had unified the two lands, commissioned sweeping temple construction at Karnak and Jebel Barkal, and set his ambitions firmly upon the Levant, that long coastal corridor of cities and trade routes that Assyria considered its own. In 674 BC, Taharqa's forces met an Assyrian army near Ashkelon and delivered a significant defeat, sending Esarhaddon's expedition back to Nineveh without its prize. Esarhaddon regrouped carefully. 2 years after his failed campaign in early 671 BC, he launched a second and far larger invasion of Egypt, this time marching slowly and deliberately, with a well-supplied army and a measured pace that would not exhaust his forces before the battle. At Harhan, along his westward route, a prophecy was revealed promising the conquest would succeed. The army crossed into Egypt and drove deep toward its heart. Memphis fell. The Nile Delta came under Assyrian control. Taharqa, unable to hold the city, retreated southward into Nubia. Members of his royal family, including Prince Nes-Anhuret and royal wives, were taken as hostages and carried back toward Assyria. With Egypt subdued, Esarhaddon's empire reached the extraordinary extent that would define it as the largest the ancient world had yet seen. From the Nile Delta in the west to the shores of the Persian Gulf in the east, from the mountains of Anatolia in the north to the fringes of the Arabian desert in the south, the Sargonid dynasty had woven together a tapestry of peoples, landscapes, and tributary kingdoms under a single authority. The Levantine coast, the cities of what are now Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Palestine, lay under Assyrian oversight. The Zagros foothills and the territory of Elam bowed eastward toward Assyrian power. It was an empire without equal in the world at that moment. Esarhaddon understood that holding Egypt would require more than military conquest. Rather than installing Assyrian governors in a land so vast and so ancient, he chose a system of indirect rule, appointing roughly 20 local Egyptian and Libyan nobles as vassal rulers over their respective territories throughout the Delta and Upper Egypt. Among them was a man named Necho of Sais and his son Psamtik. These rulers swore loyalty to the Assyrian crown, paid a regular tribute, and lived under the watchful presence of Assyrian garrisons stationed in key cities, especially Memphis. The arrangement divided Egyptian authority deliberately, setting principalities against one another rather than allowing unified resistance to grow. Esarhaddon died on the 1st of November, 669 BC in Haran, while on the road to conduct a third Egyptian campaign against Taharqa, who had reclaimed Memphis following news of the Assyrian king's decline. Before his death, Esarhaddon had taken great care to prevent the kind of succession crisis that had bloodied his own rise to power. He named his son Ashurbanipal as king of Assyria, and designated his older son Shamash-Shuma-Ukin as king of Babylon. Two brothers, side by side, intended to rule as equals. He compelled vassal states to swear advance loyalty to Ashurbanipal. His own mother, Zakutu, issued a formal loyalty treaty binding the entire court to support the succession. Ashurbanipal ascended to the Assyrian throne in 668 BC and would reign for nearly 4 decades, earning the distinction of being called the last great king of Assyria. He had been chosen as heir around 623 BC after the unexpected death of Esarhaddon's first crown prince, Sin-nadin-apli. Carefully groomed in cuneiform, statecraft, and military affairs, Ashurbanipal was a king of unusual intellectual depth. He could read and write both Akkadian and Sumerian, rare abilities among kings of his era. The early years of his reign were consumed by campaigns in Egypt, by wars against Elam, and by the slow, difficult task of holding together an empire that had grown almost too large to govern from a single throne. Among all the monuments Ashurbanipal left behind, none endures quite like his library. Gathered in the great city of Nineveh, it eventually held more than 30,000 clay tablets and fragments, the most ambitious collection of knowledge the ancient world had yet assembled. Assembled over decades through royal decree, scribal expeditions, and the systematic confiscation of texts from cities like Babylon and Nippur, it preserved the vast breadth of Mesopotamian civilization. Divination and omen literature, medical texts, mathematical treatises, historical chronicles, hymns and legal documents all found their place on its carefully organized shelves. Every tablet bore a colophon, marking it as property of the palace of Ashurbanipal, and scribes noted corrections, variants, and restorations with meticulous care. Among the tablets resting in those ordered halls was a version of a story far older than Assyria itself, the Epic of Gilgamesh, compiled by the poet Sinleki-Unnini sometime between the 13th and 10th centuries BC. In its 12th tablets, it carried the tale of a great king's search for immortality, a journey through wilderness and grief, and in its 11th tablet, a flood that swallowed the world entire. This flood account, so remarkably close in form to the later biblical narrative, would cause profound scholarly astonishment when deciphered nearly 2.5 millennia after the library's destruction. The library stood for perhaps 30 years before Nineveh fell, but the tablets survived beneath the rubble, waiting quietly for rediscovery. Yet even as Ashurbanipal's scholars gathered knowledge and his armies held vast territories from the Nile to the Persian Gulf, the empire carried within it a wound that would not close. Shamash-shuma-ukin, older, proud, and deeply resentful of his subordinate role, began secretly assembling a coalition of allies around 644 BC. Elam, Chaldean tribes, Arameans, Arab confederacies, and others joined the alliance. In 652 BC, open rebellion erupted. The civil war lasted 4 years and ended only when Babylon fell after a brutal siege, famine consuming the city from within. Shamash-shuma-ukin died in the ruins, likely in fire. Ashurbanipal prevailed, but the cost had hollowed something essential from the empire's strength. A civilization that had endured for centuries, that had bent the ancient world to its will, now stood quietly weakened at its own height. And what came next would be faster and more total than anyone in that age could have imagined. When Ashurbanipal died in 631 BC, the empire he left behind carried the weight of its own exhaustion. Decades of relentless campaigning had hollowed out its treasury and thinned its armies. His son, Ashur-etil-ilani, inherited the throne, but the succession was already shadowed by instability. His brother Sin-shara-ishkun had been granted the fortress city of Nippur and designated a successor role in Babylon. 2 sons, 2 centers of power, and between them, a vast empire beginning, slowly and quietly, to loosen at its seams. Ashur-etil-ilani reigned for only 4 years, from 631 to 627 BC, his rule marked by internal turmoil and mounting pressure from adversaries on every side. Sin-shara-ishkun succeeded him and faced almost immediately a rebellion by a rival claimant, Sin-sumu-lisir, who briefly seized the throne in 626 BC before being suppressed. These succession struggles were not minor disruptions. They signaled a deeper collapse of central authority. The aristocracy fractured. Factions competed. The empire's administrative machinery, which depended on strong royal command, began to slow and stall in the absence of decisive leadership. The empire's vulnerabilities had not appeared suddenly. They had been accumulating for years. Ashurbanipal's sack of Babylon in 648 BC had been a military victory, but a strategic wound. It generated deep resentment across Babylonia, alienating local elites and fueling rebellious sentiment that would not easily be extinguished. Egypt had already reclaimed its independence under Psamtik II. The southern Levant had slipped from Assyrian grasp. Peripheral territories, once tributaries feeding the empire's wealth, had quietly ceased contributing. The resources that once sustained endless campaigns had grown thin, and the loss of auxiliary foreign troops left the standing army increasingly strained. Into this weakening empire stepped Nabopolassar, a man of uncertain origins who called himself son of nobody in his own inscriptions. A remarkable declaration unique among Mesopotamian kings. Rising in Babylonia, he launched a coordinated revolt against Assyrian authority in 626 BC. His forces expelled Assyrian garrisons from Babylon and Nippur. The Assyrian king responded swiftly, briefly retaking Nippur and besieging Uruk and Babylon, but Nabopolassar's forces repelled both sieges. On the 22nd of November, 626 BC, he was formally crowned King of Babylon. the first independent Babylonian ruler in over a century. Nabopolassar spent years consolidating his hold over Babylonia, steadily reclaiming cities from Assyrian loyalists. By 620 BC, he had retaken Uruk and Nippur, and Assyrian forces had been effectively expelled from the south. Then, his ambition reached further north. The key to destroying Assyria entirely lay not in solitary effort but in alliance. Nabopolassar found his partner in Cyaxares, king of the Medes, a ruler who had reorganized his army into distinct divisions of spearmen, bowmen, and cavalry, expelling the Scythians from Media and forging his kingdom into a formidable military power. Two empires in ascent, bound now by shared purpose. The alliance was formalized in blood and stone after 614 BC. In that year, Median forces under Cyaxares captured Arapha and descended upon Assur, the ancient religious heart of the Assyrian world. The Babylonian army arrived as the assault was already underway, and in the aftermath of the city's fall, the two kings met and sealed their pact. The agreement was bound further by a dynastic marriage. Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabopolassar, was wed to Amytis, daughter of Cyaxares. Their shared goal was clear: the complete dismantling of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, its territories to be divided between them. By 612 BC, the combined forces of Babylonia and Media moved against Nineveh itself. Ancient Babylonian chronicles preserved on clay tablets record the siege with measured precision. 3 months of relentless assault against one of the greatest cities then existing on Earth, sprawling across approximately 750 hectares. The Allies were joined by Scythian and Cimmerian auxiliary forces. The city's defences eventually gave way, though exactly how they were breached remains unclear. Ancient accounts mention the Tigris flooding, but no definitive archaeological evidence supports this as the cause of the final breach. In August 612 BC, Nineveh fell. The fall of Nineveh was absolute. The Assyrian king Sin-Shara-Ishkun was killed in the siege. The city was plundered and burned. Those among its approximately 100,000 inhabitants who survived the house-to-house fighting were either killed or deported to the countryside to found new settlements far from the broken capital. Within a generation, Nineveh's streets fell silent. No later cuneiform tablets in Akkadian were produced there after 612 BC. When the Greek historian Xenophon passed through in the 4th century BC, he found only a broad mound of earth, abandoned, unnamed, already forgotten by the world that had once trembled before its walls. A remnant survived. Sin-Shara-Ishkun's brother, Ashur-Uballit II, gathered what remained of the Assyrian forces and retreated westward to Haran, establishing there a final seat of Assyrian kingship. Egypt, under Pharaoh Necho II, sent military support, not from affection for Assyria, but from strategic concern about Babylonian expansion into the Levant. A weakened Assyrian buffer served Egyptian interests more than a powerful Babylonian neighbor, yet all efforts proved insufficient. Haran fell to the Medo-Babylonian alliance in 610 BC. A desperate attempt to retake the city failed. Ashur-Uballit II vanished from historical records, his fate unrecorded. The final blow came at Carchemish in 605 BC, where Nebuchadnezzar II, commanding in his father's name, defeated the remaining Assyrian forces and their Egyptian allies in a decisive battle. With that, organized Assyrian resistance ended entirely. The great cities followed one another into silence. Kalhu was sacked around 616 BC and rapidly abandoned. Dur-Sharrukin had already been deserted since 705 BC. Ashur emptied after 609 BC. Within decades, the Assyrian heartland had become sparsely populated ruins. The empire that had once deported nations and built libraries fell so completely that classical Greek writers barely recognize these mounds as the remains of any civilization at all. What remained of Assyria lived only in borrowed memory, in Greek and Persian accounts that preserved fragments of its reputation for military power and ruthless efficiency, in Hebrew scriptures that recorded its violence and its fall, and in the grass-covered mounds that travelers crossed without knowing what lay beneath. When Alexander the Great passed near the ruins of Nineveh in 331 BC, he saw only a mound of earth and received oral accounts of its former greatness. Nothing more. It would take another 2,000 years and the careful brushwork of 19th century archaeologists before Ashurbanipal's library emerged again from the soil. And so, the empire of Ashur passed not into legend, but into silence, its cities buried, its kings forgotten, until the patient work of scholars and their brushes began, one clay tablet at a time, to bring it quietly back to life.